views and opinions expressed by callers, guests, and hosts do not necessarily reflect those of the Black Talk Radio Network and Black Talk Media Project. Black Talk Radio is new black media for the new millennium.
Good evening, sisters and brothers, and welcome to all our listeners. Our program this evening will continue our discussions of our experiences as Afro-descendant people and as workers in the United States. More specifically, we will be considering some of the many corporate and political assaults on our economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as our varied forms of resistance to such attacks. For this week's edition, we have come to Chicagoland and Northwest Indiana, where we will be speaking with some of the Midwest region's most dedicated and experienced freedom fighters of Chicago and Gary, Indiana. That's GI. Our guest this evening will be RENEE HATCHER, law professor and human rights attorney, Reverend Dr. John Jackson Sr., a liberation pastor and activist, and LORENZO CROWELL, a 31-year veteran labor organizer with the Service Employees International Union. Welcome to each and all of you, and how are you all doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Is RENEE out there?
Doing well, thanks for having me.
What about Reverend Dr. Jackson?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Doing all right.
All right. Tonight's program is dedicated to the memory of our own beloved Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, born on May 19, 1925, and assassinated on February 21, 1965. We honor Malcolm X not only because he was fearless in demonstrating his love of black people in this country and around the world, but also because he earnestly sought to educate us regarding the necessity to understand our experiences and our struggles in human rights terms. Like a number of freedom fighters before him, Brother Malcolm worked to advance black liberation in part by bringing our oppression and our resistance struggles to the attention of the entire world through the United Nations. Let me begin by briefly returning to and emphasizing a few points regarding the race treaty. We have been building these Friday night programs around the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This convention, or treaty, was the product of the international movements during the 1960s to put an end to colonialism and the racial domination of the peoples of Africa, Asia, the Americas, indeed, the entire globe. The powerful social movements of oppressed people in the United States were essential components of those broader struggles for liberation and development. The third, or I-third, as it is sometimes referred to, was adopted in December of 1965 and commits its members to the elimination of racial discrimination and the promotion of understanding among all races. CERD was initially signed by the U.S. in 1966 and later ratified by the Senate in 1994. It is one of only 3 international human rights treaties that have been ratified by the U.S., and it is binding on the states and the federal government under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. The third has a complaint procedure which members of U.S. society can use to document and expose violations of our human rights. The United States must report periodically on its record to uphold the human rights protected in this treaty. The U.S. government submitted its report to the United Nations in June 2013 and went before the Review Committee in Geneva in August 2014 to answer questions about what the government is doing and not doing to address and dismantle racism in the U.S. Members of U.S. civil society also submitted information to the committee to help inform the committee. At the review in Geneva, activists and advocates provided in-person interventions from the ground, detailing what was actually being experienced by everyday people on a daily basis in communities of color across the U.S. The next review of U.S. compliance and non-compliance will be in November 2017. For additional information, including access to previous race treaty programs, please go to www.blacktalkradionetwork.com. Again, www.blacktalkradionetwork.com. For information on previous CERD committee conclusions regarding U.S. discrimination, and for more specific information on how to document local violations of human rights under this treaty, please contact the U.S. Human Rights Network at www.ushrnetwork.org. Once again, www.ushrnetwork.org. So now let's get into some conversation with our esteemed panelists. I'm going to come to you first, Renee. As a human rights lawyer, tell us about some of the kinds of attacks you have been witnessing during the past several years on the economic and social rights of Black people in the areas of the United States in which you have worked and taught.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much, Tanabantu. I'm so happy to be a part of this program, and I think it's particularly fitting for us to be talking about human rights and specifically economic and social and cultural rights to celebrate the birthday of Malcolm X today. One of the things that Malcolm pushed for certainly was to reframe the entire conversation for Black liberation in the United States and to push each other really to rethink and think about the limitations of civil rights, right? Civil rights and the limits of citizenship or second-class citizenship of Black citizens in the U.S. and start to reframe our struggle in the context of human rights. And the fact of the matter is human rights supersede civil rights in many ways, but they come way before civil rights in terms of what's possible in this country. In my experience and in terms of some of the work that I do, I consider myself to be a community development lawyer who cares about Black and marginalized communities. And I think it's important for me, and it has always been important to take a human rights framework to the work that I do. And I've seen the attack on economic and social and cultural rights in different ways. One, certainly, most of my work has been in city centers, whether it be Chicago or Baltimore, Gary, Indiana. But then beyond that, you see a lot of parallels in terms of the experiences of people across this country right now. And so some of my work really has been in pushing the U.S. To actually ratify the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights so that there's a new platform really available to us to enforce those sorts of rights. But let me just paint a picture, I think, which might be helpful in terms of what we're talking about when we say economic, social, and cultural rights. We're talking about the right to work. We're talking about the right to health and healthcare system in this country and the fact that so many people still do not have access. We're talking about the right to water, which is one specific area which I've had a lot of experience with, particularly in Baltimore, where thousands and thousands of residents had their water shut off because of unpaid bills or sometimes just billing errors. As you can imagine, Baltimore being primarily black, with a large population that's living below the poverty line, you know, the majority of the people who experienced those water shutoffs were working class black folks. And more than that, you know, experience of water shutoff has a number of different consequences that people then had to somehow deal with. A lot of times people would get evicted. There were instances in which children were removed from the home because they didn't have access to running water or to, you know, basic sanitation because they didn't have water services. You know, obviously it caused further hardship when people owned their home and lost their home because of outstanding water bills. So that's just one example of some of the work that they're done around economic and social and cultural rights. But then in addition to that, you know, it also includes the right to housing. And housing, affordable housing, has really become a crisis in the last few years across the country. And more, we do not have adequate affordable housing for folks, or as there's kind of a resurgence of people that are interested in moving back into, you know, downtown areas or urban centers, we find that a lot of times working class black folks get pushed out and do not have many options then for affordable housing. And then finally, obviously education is one of those rights as well, and having a healthy environment. But then more than that, cultural rights. Cultural in particular is something that, you know, African Americans certainly have, you know, really been on the short end of the stick on in this country. We have systematically been denied our right to practice various cultural practices and been systematically disconnected from our culture in many different ways. You know, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade, being disconnected from our cultural practices, being disconnected from our language. We also see reverberations of that today, in terms of the way in which black culture sometimes is fetishized, but then also criminalized. So, you know, I would say we need to start talking about economic, social, and cultural rights more, and start thinking about the ways in which, you know, this is becoming a real problem in our day-to-day lives, and the way in which it affects particularly black folks in this country.
Thank you so much for that intro, Counselor. Let me turn to you now, Lorenzo, because you have 31 years of organizing, and you've done a lot of that organizing with members of the black working class. What prompted you to become a labor organizer with a particular passion for working with black workers?
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for allowing us the honor to be on this program, to be able to talk about this. So thank you for that. And I'm
no problem,
proud to be in the presence of such esteemed folks. The reason why I got involved, as a young man, I was 19 years old. I started working at a Catholic acute care hospital in Gary, Indiana, which was run by the nuns at that time. And as a young worker, the first day I came to work, my dad had been a steel worker in the Gary steel mills. And the first question I asked at the lunch table is, do you have a union there? And some of the veteran workers there told me, boy, you better shut up, because you're going to get fired on your first day of work talking about a union. I said, well, why? My dad's a steel worker. So that kind of, you know, opened my eyes. And then and that was in 1972, I started out working there for $2.15 an hour. And the other workers and myself began to have conversations over the course of my employment, the early days of it, wondering why the nuns would not listen to our outcries for economic improvements and improvements in our benefits and working conditions, and that it seemed to fall on deaf ears, and did. And so a group of us got together as workers inside that hospital and organized it, and we won our union election in 1974, a couple of years later. And then from that point, we began to bargain contracts. I stayed on as a steward during the 14 years that I worked at that hospital, and I also served as a worker on all of the bargaining committees for the contracts. Then after that, in 1986, I came out full-time working for the union and have been there ever since. And so the impetus for me was that the city was predominantly black. Healthcare workers were some of the last workers to be organized in the labor movement. They're part of the service sector of employees in our society, and they are still, to this day, some of the lowest paid out of organized labor. Even with our efforts to improve wages, hours, and working conditions, through our efforts, even going through strikes and demonstrations and the like of that. So I was compelled, in 1986, out of 13 applicants for the union position, I was chosen, and I was very humbled and honored to get that position. But I've tried to just immerse myself into improving black workers' lives through the collective bargaining process, through collective action at the workplace, outside of the workplace. I've tried to do it through working with others in the community to have town hall meeting forums. I am the longest sitting member of color on the Central Labor Council for all of the unions in Northern Indiana, and this is my fourth term doing that. And to be the only black person, or one of the couple of black folks sitting on that board, I try to influence my counterparts that don't look like me to work with us and to help raise the standard bar for our members, as well as those who are paid much higher in the crafts and in the industrial sector of the workforce, but also to try to spur dialogue and community activism within the community of Gary and the surrounding area, because there are so many people of color and minorities, Hispanics also, that reside in Northwest Indiana, whose voices are not being heard, and we try to coalesce with them to make a difference in our society. Right now, Gary has one hospital, and it has been considered to be merged with another Catholic hospital who is totally non-union, and it's a larger health system. And the workers that are in those particular jobs are not predominantly people of color, and the folks that are in the only black hospital in the city of Gary are, and they're our members. And we've fought over 30 years to even get the contract to the level it's at in terms of the wages, hours, and benefits that they have. And at the onset of the organizing drive at Methodist Hospital, the hospital I'm referring to, the management would not even let Coretta Scott King in the door when we were organizing that hospital. The day that they had the union election, management was giving out turkeys and passing them out to the workers to try to dissuade them against unionizing, with Coretta Scott there to try to influence the workers otherwise. So there's been a tumultuous fight over a long period of time, and it continues to go on. And as I see the city of Gary now, I saw it at its apex when I was a young man. I'm a lifelong resident of Gary for 64 years, and I still believe that it like Sister Hatcher so aptly put it, there is a move across this country to, if you will, regentrify all of our major cities. It happened in Detroit. It's happening,
Yes.
here in Gary. When they created Maryville, when Renee's dad was mayor of the city of Gary, one of the first black mayors in the United States, those folks created Maryville as a result of being defiant about a black man being in control of a city in Gary who had all the amenities and where people who were of Caucasian descent and others would frequent the city of Gary because it had everything that they wanted, and that's where it was the destination of shopping and everything else. It was the Mecca of Northwest Indiana. And so the year I graduated from high school in 1971, they chose to annex that portion of Gary and created the town of Maryville. And it's unfortunate that happened because of the racial motivation that existed and prompted them to do it. It was still unfortunate. Even some of the businesses that are in Maryville now, prime example, Gary Camera, still carries the name of Gary Camera, but it sits in Maryville, right there on Broadway for everyone to see. So there was a shift, a dynamic shift by those who are not people of color to go to Maryville, and now there's one thing they forgot when they left the city of Gary, and that was we had the lakefront, we had the Gary Airport, we had the rail system infrastructure, and that right in the smack dab in the middle of Gary, there are all sorts of highways. You have the toll road, you have 80, 94, and I-65, which are the crossroads of America and will take you to any parts in these United States. So I think that the biggest problem I see going forward is that people, the system, it's a systemic problem, as Renee pointed out as well. People are so preoccupied with trying to survive. Our members who still do not make enough money, even with us fighting to improve their conditions, work 2 jobs. They're single mothers, heads of household, and so they're so preoccupied. If we ask them to come to a demonstration or to go to a school board meeting or to go to a city council meeting or some other activity, or it is real hard for them to make those meetings, even though we believe that they should and encourage them to do so. The system has really hindered their ability to do that and still take care of their families and have some semblance of a quality of life. It's problematic, and the schools, for the average person in our members category, it's virtually impossible for them to have the financial wherewithal to attend an institution of higher learning because they don't make enough, and the scholarships and Pell Grants and everything have just about dried up that used to be offered openly to people who were in distressed financial conditions. So I think all of those are contributing factors to our dilemma that we face at the crossroads, as I call it, in this period in black folks' history. And we have to lead the charge and meet the challenge. And it has to be passed on to the youth because they are our future fighters and our current fighters. And I believe they have the savvy and the smarts and the ability to carry this fight into the next millennium if necessary.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Reverend Jackson?
Yes, sir.
I'm coming to you now, and I want to change just a little bit, change the questioning just a little bit. You have heard the spot-on responses of both Renee and Lorenzo, and you deal with these conditions that face the majority of the folk in your congregation, Trinity United Church of Christ in Gary. You see this all across Northwest Indiana as you move around representing the gospel. What does it mean to you to live in the midst of these kinds of conditions and to define yourself as a liberation pastor?
Well, thank you, Tom Bantu and Renee and Lorenzo and those who are listening. It means to me, you mentioned the name of my church, pastor, Trinity United Church of Christ in Gary. Our motto is, we are not just another church, but we are a culturally conscious, Christ-centered church committed to the community. We are unashamedly Black, and we are unapologetically Christian. And so it means to me, first, that we're helping to, construct and create a faith community whose focus is on the lives of those who are outside of the church. And we attempt to create what I call public space, utilizing our building not to get new members, but to utilize the building as public space for strategizing, organizing, mobilizing people affected most by the oppressive public policies that we have to deal with and help change them. And so that's the first thing, creating space that is both sacred and deals with the secular, spiritual, and social. But it also means for me personally that I'm tasked with crafting and preaching sermons and studies that assist in critiquing the oppressive structure of the empire that we live in, and this corporate state and the political system that negatively impacts poor and marginalized people in our context and beyond. And so that finally kind of leads to trying to broaden the faith belief of people who have been unfortunately taught a parochial version of the religion of the radical and revolutionary African from Palestine by the name of Jesus, and helping folk to embrace a prophetic theology of justice for the oppressed, which is embodied actually in Jesus' inaugural sermon that we would call it his trial sermon in Luke 4, where he borrowed from Isaiah 61 by saying, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captive, recovery of sight to the blind, and set the oppressed free." And so, it tasked me with trying to help folk bridge the gap between the spiritual and social, the holy and the human, to see that our faith at its best is not to make heaven better, to quote the late Justice R. Eugene Pincham. Jesus didn't come here to make heaven better, which helps us push against the narrative and the theology of the empire or civil religion in this country that has people thinking individualistically, pietistically about trying to get a seat in the heaven. It ain't about heaven. It ain't about going to heaven. It's as I like to say, it's something sound on the ground by the pound while we're still around. It's about making life better for us right here, and our faith at its best impacts people who are the marginalized. Liberation, this liberation theological perspective demonstrates that God has a preference for the poor. And no matter where you look in the scriptures, the Christian scriptures, the Judeo-Christian heritage, you find people under oppression fighting against oppression from Genesis to Revelation. And so that what it means for me is trying to build, help people build a theology that actually represents Jesus Christ and not one that represents self.
Thank you. That's a powerful testimony and witness. And since you have brought up the question of people fighting against the empire, many things that are denying us our economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as our civil and political rights. I want to pivot back to Renee and Lorenzo. Renee, you go first, if you will, please, and talk about some of the ways in which you have seen folk fighting against, trying to resist the very kinds of oppressive policies that Lorenzo, you, and Dr. Jackson have referenced just a bit earlier.
Yeah, and I think maybe, I think it's important as we kind of dig into where we're currently at and the kind of resistance that communities are waging. I think it's important to lift up just the fact that blacks who have come from the United States blacks have a long history and tradition of human rights struggle and organizing. Almost since the very beginning of the United Nations, various black institutions based in the United States have petitioned to the United Nations for their rights, starting in 1946 with the National Negro Congress, and then thinking about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois with the NAACP, and delivering the speech that he did in petitioning for the rights of African Americans and talking about things that were happening in the U.S. Against blacks in terms of lynchings, in terms of the brutality and the dehumanization that they face on a daily basis. And with the famous petition in 1951, we charged genocide. I say all that to say that we have a very long tradition of resisting and standing up for our human rights. Part of the We Charge Genocide petition, they explicitly talked about the kind of economic genocide that was being waged against black folks in the United States, and that the government was complicit in and intelligence in the U.S. and talking about things like Jim Crow, the various policies associated with Jim Crow, talking about vacancy laws in which people were getting locked up for nearly nothing or for not necessarily entering into these very exploitative relationships with ex-slave owners. So I think it's really important that what we recognize our history of resistance and standing up and asserting our human rights. And Malcolm X certainly was a part of that tradition with so much of the work that he did. In terms of today, I always, no matter how bad things might seem, I'm always generally encouraged because as long as I think if you stay grounded in community and you, are working really to create a better situation for your people, I generally am always encouraged because so many people are doing so much good work. And I have met some of the most brilliant, most resilient, most consistent people, doing the really hard, difficult work, doing the organizing work, creating institutions that will make their lives better, in addition to trying to hold, the government accountable in various ways. So I would say that there's a wide range of things that are currently happening. The conversations that people are having, not only around police brutality and the organizing to hold them accountable, but also the conversations around economic violence that happens in black communities, that have been perpetrated by the government through policies like redlining, through policies like abandonment of entire neighborhoods and sometimes cities, right? And I think Gary's a really good example in thinking about this. Gary was a majority black city And the election of my father, in part, was an assertion that, one, black folks want to live wherever they decide to live, and that they wanted an end to formal segregation in the city of Gary, and that certainly was the case before he became mayor and changed that policy. You know, they needed quality housing. That was one of the major things that programs that he put forward soon after he became mayor. They wanted the jobs that were available, you know, through the city. They did not have access historically to those jobs. People wanted quality jobs. People wanted to be able to shop at the various, you know, businesses that existed in the city at that time. And, you know, as Lorenzo was saying, Gary also, I think, then becomes an example of the way in which there's a often vitriol backlash, white backlash to the assertion of human rights by black communities collectively, because certainly the kind of policies that were passed downstate were really put in place to undermine the city and undermine, you know, what things were possible, in addition to white flight, in addition to passing a state law that basically said, well, the white folks can move, you know, a half a mile outside of the city and start their own thing. And it becomes very telling. I think, you know, Gary's a very stark example of this, because, you know, it was in 1972 that Maryville, the town of Maryville, was incorporated, right? And what was happening in 1972 in Gary? Well, you know, my father was still the mayor. He was the first black mayor of Gary, any major city in the northern part of 1972, and this is also the time when he was put people. Also, racial segregation and discrimination in the city in various ways. But too, like political convention came to Gary, in part because other cities and other mayors were not willing to host it. And so you see in 1972, I think you see probably the most dramatic example of white flight outside of the city, but you also see, you know, then the formation of Maryville. That only happens because, you know, a number of folks get together downstate in Indianapolis and pass a law that makes it possible for them to incorporate Maryville, but that was not possible in any other part of the state. They basically passed a law that undid the protections that cities enjoyed in the state of Indiana to basically make sure that they didn't lose their population. And they only passed it specific to the city of Gary. And then obviously, you know, subsequently there have been a number of different things that the state has done that has undermined, I would say, the success and the quality of life of citizens in the city of Gary, including things like property tax caps and that kind of thing. But I say all that to say that people have a history, and I would say there are a number of organizations, communities that are constantly engaged in not only resistance, but also building an alternative, right, that works for providing for our collective material needs. And luckily, you know, I feel very privileged in the fact that I, in some way, can be a part of that work in providing legal support to organizations that are starting things like community land trusts, or starting things like worker cooperatives. So, you know, trying to think about different ways in which we can democratize, right, the workplace, democratize our economy, and actually own the things in our neighborhood to make sure that we have control over them. And I really think that's really important as we start to think about, right, asserting our right to self-determination. You know, a lot of times I think we tend to focus on electoral politics or making sure that there are more black spaces in high places. But I think that, you know, is not necessarily responsive to the fact that it becomes so much more than that. In terms of the way in which power functions in this country and under this capitalist system, it has to be more than simply, you know, electing black officials. It also has to be thinking about the ways in which we could democratize our economy, the way in which we hold them accountable, the way in which people build power and movements to actually put pressure on those that are supposed to represent us. So, I would just say that I could give so many different examples of the way in which people are asserting their economic, cultural rights. In terms of resisting, I would say the failures, certainly, of our government to fulfill things like a right or access to housing or a right to health care, or thinking about certainly the almost obliteration of workers' rights that has been going on in a systematic way across the country. But I think people have been resisting, but more importantly, they are also kind of building institutions that can provide for their material needs that actually are responsive to the direct needs of communities, that fulfill things like affordable housing, thinking about the ways in which we can work together cooperatively, make sure that we all have access to quality education or critical thinking, and the number of freedom schools that you see around the country now, and the kind of really, I think, critical education that doesn't necessarily exist in the public education system, for example. So I would generally just say I am encouraged by all that is currently happening, and it's never easy, but people are organizing and resisting, and I think we should all take comfort in that, and also figure out how we can move that ball forward and contribute to those efforts.
Wow, yes. Thank you so much. There's one thing before Lorenzo and Reverend Jackson, before I get back to you, let me just squeeze in here and just underscore something that RENEE has said very eloquently, I believe. This notion of human rights is all too often associated with the UN. It's all too often associated with what's happening in other countries. But what RENEE has put her finger on, and what I think both you, Reverend Jackson, and Lorenzo have also begun to talk about to some extent, is a very important principle that I think we see alive and well, not only amongst Afrodescendant people, but amongst a whole range of other people around this country. And that is that human rights is fundamentally not a matter of documents. It is fundamentally a question of those rights that we have by virtue of being born. As my mom used to say, you're right as a child of God. And those rights are born in struggle, and they are implemented through struggle. The only way we're going to have access to the human rights that we have, that are sometimes talked about in various international documents, is if we fight for them. And so what we're seeing, I think, RENEE mentioned it, she talked about it, Lorenzo talked about it also, because it's part of his everyday experience. Reverend Jackson has begun to talk about it. We have rights not only because we are born human beings, but because we fight to make those rights our own. You can't have rights. We can't have rights that we haven't fought for, that we're not willing to fight for. So, Lorenzo, say a little bit more, if you will, about some of the kinds of struggles that you have been witnessing. I believe you have something coming up at the end of May. Well, you opened up talking about the fight to maintain the contract and the fight to avoid having this privatization of is it a privatization battle that you are dealing with?
Well, it's not actually the privatization. It's the changing of the system of health care as it has been previously delivered in the city of Gary to a Catholic hospital health system, Franciscan, who is, like I said, non-union. All their other facilities were the only unionized facility. It will be a full asset merger if they acquire Methodist hospitals. Now, what that does and what that looks like depends on the demand of the people to maintain quality healthcare services in the city of Gary. We only have one hospital left, and because after St. Mary's went through an ordeal back in earlier fights where the nuns decided to get out of the healthcare in the city of Gary, and so there in its wake exists only Methodist hospitals, and the citizens of Gary deserve, and in Maryville as well, because we represent both hospitals. They're part of a two-hospital system. And thanks to Renee's dad, there was a consent decree that was filed in the 70s when Methodist was going to build another hospital before they built South Lake in Maryville. And the problem was St. Mary's had built theirs out in Hobart, and so part of the impetus to file that lawsuit was to say, well, wait a minute, let's make sure that equal services are maintained in Gary as they are further south in Maryville, Indiana, with the other, the facility hospital in Maryville of Methodist. And so that began, and it was filed by Renee's dad, and I believe it was Barbara Leek Wesson and some others who filed that. And it wound up going through the Office of Civil Rights and the U.S. Office of Civil Rights, and it actually has been in place since then. So that, requirement is still there. It's our understanding that the hospital is during the course of this due diligence that they have between the two entities trying to merge, are trying to look at how they can modify or eliminate the consent decree. Now, what does that mean for the level of health care that the citizens of Gary would receive, and would it remain equal? Because they're talking about building a $330 million brand new hospital in Gary, and you cannot be so starved for economic development by giving up something like that consent decree totally, because in my estimation, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, does that mean once they build that $330-some-odd million brand new hospital in the city of Gary, what happens in those subsequent years?
Excuse me, Lorenzo, we're having some issues with your line. Let me mute you and unmute you. Hopefully that'll clear it up. Okay.
Okay.
All right, that worked. Go ahead, sir. We have, just to let everybody know, we got about 12 minutes till station ID. Please continue.
Okay. So, the citizens need to be at this town hall meeting. We're putting it out. We've had one of our rank and file members.
When is that?
Hello?
When is the town meeting?
It's Wednesday, May 31st at 5 p.m. at Ivy Tech Community College in Gary. That's 1440 East 35th Avenue in Gary, Indiana. And the entire subject matter will be what is the future of the Methodist hospitals as it relates to this proposed merger. And, the citizens have a right to ask questions. The president and CEO, Raymond Grady, has agreed to be on the panel to be there. Stephen Mays, who's the president of the Gary NAACP chapter, will be there. Reverend Jackson will be the moderator for that event. We will have our president, our new president of our local, Greg Kelly, out of SEIU Healthcare. He will be there. Also, we will have Charlie Brown and the Senator Eddie Melton, who has been the replacement for Earlene Rogers as our new senator downstate for this district. And hopefully they will be there to answer questions and to take field questions from the citizens as it relates to their concerns about the future of healthcare at Methodist Hospital in the city of Gary and Maryville, both, because we have members that work there. We have about 600 employees who are under our union contract, but I believe Methodist has 2,400 employees total between Gary and Maryville, and we're concerned. So we would urge everyone to come out, because the events like this are what empowers folks and what moves them to action. Because if people are not involved at a grassroots level and are there to express their concerns or discontent or whatever the case may be, then the people that are in control of the fate of what could happen, who are not citizens, will just continue to do what they choose to do without question by the people who are going to be recipients of the services. And our members are... Yes, go ahead.
No, I just wanted you to... I'm so glad that you are, sort of bringing this to our attention, not only for our listeners around the country, but also for brothers and sisters in Northwest Indiana and Chicagoland, because you have pointed out two things, I think, that we don't often think of together. People thinking about how healthcare is changing and could be changed might be inclined to think only as many of us who see ourselves as potential patients or people who are in need of good health care. But you have pointed out, I'm so glad you've done this, the relationship, I think, between people who are in the community and need health care and also the people in the very same community who work to deliver those health care services. And if this new situation is allowed to go forward without people in the community saying what we need and what should be done in terms of our human rights to health, in terms of our human rights to adequate income at our jobs, the whole community is going to be suffering. Is that not right?
That's correct. And like I stated earlier in the broadcast, there's that union has been there since 1979. So the workers have fought for and toiled very hard to get to the level of wages that they're at now. And those wages are above minimum wage, and we're trying to make improvements each time we go to the bargaining table. The contract currently doesn't expire until next June, so there's a window, and depending on how the new prospective employer reacts to once this merger is done, or what the final details of it are, will definitely have a drastic effect over those wages, hours, and working conditions that we have currently under the collective bargaining agreement. And the workers are concerned about maintaining that, and for that to go forward into whatever transpires, and also to be able to improve on it as things go forward.
Reverend Jackson, is it possible in your estimation, as a representative of the gospel in Northwest Indiana, in Gary, is it possible for us to get our pastors, our other pastors? I know you're engaged. You are already engaged. But what are some of the challenges that we might face in getting our pastors, because we know that a number of the brothers and sisters in the community who are potential patients for health care, as well as people who work to deliver good health care to their brothers and sisters in the city. We know that these folks go to church as well. We know that folks bring their tithes and offerings to the church as well. Say a little bit, if you can, Dr. Jackson, about maybe some of the kinds of things that we need to try to do as we're trying to look toward this intensification of struggle to get our pastors to take into consideration the needs of our people. One brother said, forget the brother's name right now, but he talks about how Jesus viewed the needs of the people as holy. And it seems to me that what we're hearing Lorenzo and Renee and you talk about are the fact that, yes, indeed, the needs are holy, but they're not being always looked upon as such. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the challenge we have, just broadly starting, is the challenge we're dealing with the damage that white supremacy and chattel slavery has inflicted upon people of African descent. And so that's some very deep damage. And within that,
yes.
Many in particular in the areas of theological enterprise, clergy and whatnot, are also, severely affected by that. And then you accompany that with the individualistic prosperity nature, celebrity culture that we exist in. It has affected people in the church, so that unfortunately there are churches that are just little empires, because again, for some people it is just about, as Lorenzo said, is A, about surviving, and B, is about trying to mirror the celebrity culture that we have, so that we're looking at life from a classist way of seeing things. So people trying to be middle class instead of middle income and move up. And so you have clergy that are doing that. And unfortunately, the other part to it is you have a lot of clergy that are untrained, and they haven't been to seminary because, it's easy to turn your collar around. And so, when you say get pastors on board to do this, well, I advocate that, it ain't about going to the pastors trying to convince them. Because if something is working for them, where they're personally profiting off of the pathology and poverty of their people, they're not likely to change that just by you talking to them. I can talk to clergy all day long about the religion of Jesus and not Christianity, and I can show them in biblical scriptures that demonstrate that Jesus, had a different way of seeing this faith journey. And it ain't gonna have no effect on them because they're used to doing it this way. Now, what you do is, if the people in the church begin to change, then the pastors. Then remember, King at the height, there was only about 1,000 churches across the country that supported him. Why? Because people were locked into a pietistic, self-centered, going to heaven type of theology. And so King couldn't depend on the churches. And so it was people like Malcolm and others who were talking, first of all, who were reminding us that we are an African people, that we are a people of history, that yes, our legacy and our history has been messed with and messed up, as Attorney Renee pointed out. We have been in some ways detached from it because of the system that we live in. But Malcolm was reminding us, no, you got a history that goes beyond slavery. You are not a slave, and you are not the descendant of slaves. And so, that helped build that revolutionary movement we call the Civil Rights Movement. And it helped because people began to say, you know what, as James Brown said, I'm black and I'm proud. They began to look at that. And guess what? Pastors in churches began to get on board. They started letting their hair grow and wear afros and all that type of stuff. But it's the people. It's the people. If we can get people, if we can inspire people, guess what? They're gonna go back to the church and say, Pastor, how come you ain't over there, at that town hall meeting about Methodist Hospital? Because I work at Methodist Hospital. And if you ain't going, I see you going through there praying for the sick, but I need you to talk about, the administration and what's going on, that they're trying to pass it into a Catholic establishment who don't deal with contraceptives. And we're in the inner city, and they don't want to deal with contraceptives. And they talking about
that's right.
The wage is different. Pastor, what do you got to say about that? Because it ain't about what you say about, so-called what you think about faith. It's about me living day to day here. This is about Monday through Saturday here. When you get people to do that, guess what? Pastor try to run and get on board. That's the key, because too many times we want to say, well, get the pastors this, and I understand it, but I'm telling you, when you get the people moving, then the pastors begin to move. Because I don't, well, let me end right there. I'm about to go into another.
Well, no, this is Rich. I believe we have to go to station identification. Scotty, you want to move us on in that direction?
Make Black Talk Radio your choice for digital black radio. New black media for the new millennium.
Good evening once again, and thank you for tuning in to this edition of Black Talk Radio Network. Tonight, our Race Treaty program, which we have every Friday night, is in honor of Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, to many of us, who died because of his assassination on February 21st, 1965. But he was born May 19th, 1925, and so we are very thankful to the Creator that Malcolm was born. We're thankful to Malcolm. Despite his turbulent life, he contributed immensely, particularly toward the process of helping us to understand our conditions and our struggles here in the United States in human rights terms. And this evening, of course, I'm Tom DeBontu Iverson, and I'm your co-host, and we are very fortunate to have RENEE HATCHER, law professor and human rights attorney, Reverend Dr. John Jackson Sr., also from Gary, Indiana, a liberation pastor and activist, and Brother Lorenzo Crowell, someone I've known for quite a long time. He helped me get my chops in labor studies. He's been 31 years a labor organizer with Service Employees International Union. We're so thankful and pleased to have every one of these individuals because they represent, in my estimation, some of the most steadfast, sincere, and persistent freedom fighters that we have today, particularly in the Midwest. So now we want to just circle back to what you were saying, Reverend Jackson, before station identification. You were calling on us. You were basically saying, what we need to do if we want people to think more, and if we want pastors in our faith congregations to begin to act as Aubrey Hendricks has said, to act as if the people's needs are actually holy. If we want pastors to take up the struggles of our people, we're not going to be able to wait until the pastors decide that it's in their interest. The members of the congregation are going to have to begin to organize ourselves, and as a result of that, we can then apply some pressure to those brothers and sisters in the clergy who, unfortunately, have become so victimized in so many instances with what you, Dr. Jackson, have called bad theology. So I'd like for you to just say a word or two now and begin this second segment of our discussion with some reflections on how we actually do that. What are some of the major challenges that you see, Dr. Jackson, to the kind of organizing that you believe we need to pursue if, in fact, our faith communities are going to really be about the gospel and about the needs of the people?
well, one of the, because I deal in inspiration, information, and empowerment of people to build up, to help build up a person's soul and spirit, mindset, emotions, so that then, you know, they are inspired to do something about the conditions that are affecting them. So the first thing is, and I think Lorenzo was touching on it, and Renee has touched on it, that people are so inundated with the empire and its strategies that wear people out. And then you couple that in particular with people of African descent, that, you know, we're dealing with the residue of chattel slavery. We're dealing with white supremacy. We're dealing with the narratives that constantly bombard us, that try to tell us, you know, we're the most criminal and we're the most this or that try to beat us down by showing us, just like what happened in Tulsa, where a white woman officer who shoots a man down in cold blood with his hands up is now let go. The jury acquits her. The jury lets her go. Those things have a very devastating effect on people that gives people sometimes the feeling that, you know, what is the use? And so the first challenge we have is to build people up, to help people see the average person, the person that's trying to you know, make ends meet, that's been beating the pavement to try to put these applications in, you know, to try to get, you know, some gainful employment, to build up their spirit, you know. And one of the ways, you know, we see to do that in my context is, you know, because I deal with majority African descendant people. We have various people in the congregation, but we're in Gary, Indiana, majority African descendant people. And we need to know, people need to be reminded that you're greater than it seems like. There is blood in your veins. You are connected. Your DNA has within it the means to overcome and the means to govern. Because one of the things that's happened in Gary, and you heard Lorenzo and Renee point this out, is that Gary was hit by a strong force of white supremacy. I liken it to Haiti. Haiti is the first country in this hemisphere to overthrow the oppressive practice, self-determination. And what happened? America, Britain, and France teamed up to attack Haiti just because they decided that they didn't want people subjugating them anymore. And they held that wrench against them for I don't know how many years, all because they decided to exercise self-determination. Same thing happened with Gary. And what it's trying to demonstrate to people is don't ever think that you are supposed to rule yourself. And we got to change that narrative, that we have already ruled great nations, and nothing you do. You kill off leaders if you want, you can beat us down, but we're going to keep coming back. Like the poem says, strong men and women keep coming. And so the first line is we got to help build up people's spirit. And the way we do that is we need, you know, one of the things that we need the intellectuals among us and those who have been able to make some space for themselves in this system to be present in the community, to be present in the areas of blight, to be present so people can see. Again, Justice R.Eugene Pincham used to say, you can't be what you don't see. And so when you see folk laboring with you. Now, this is the other part of this is that this is a labor of love, and it ain't going to happen overnight. And so institution building is difficult and is long. You know, building our church is a new church start, and we're about 12 years old, and we're still building, and we need people to help build up an institution that will create the beloved community. So I just want to lift up the first part is to build up people's spirits, to let people know who you are and whose you are, and that as Oprah Winfrey has in that book, that we have no ruler but God. And so when we recognize that, as Malcolm would say, that, you know, we are a great people, that we are a people of destiny and history, that we are people who have managed billions before, and we can do it again. We are the people that taught civilization to Europeans. We're the people that gave them Christianity. Christianity didn't start in Europe. It started in Africa by black people. Islam started by black people. Buddhism started by black people. We started the major religions here. We are the ones that created. We are the ones, that created all of the disciplines and handed them to the world for the use of the world. And we got to remind our people that this ain't hyperbole. This is fact. And there's other people that don't want you to be able to embrace that, because many of our people right now find it difficult to embrace because all they see is blight. And so we got to help change that narrative. That's the thing that I'm laboring in. That's one of the first areas we got to address.
Yes. Thank you for that. Lorenzo and Renee, please, same question. What are some of the major challenges that you think you see in the work that each of you is doing?
Renee, did you want to start, or?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think I would probably echo some of the things that have already been said and thinking about the challenges. I think as Lorenzo was talking about the issue currently with Methodists, as they consolidate or merge or look to merge with another system, and are thinking about what that will mean not only for potential patients or access to health care then for people in Gary, but then also the workers. And I think that story is really, indicative of the larger kind of obstacles we're facing right now. I mean, the way in which neoliberalism has infected every single part of our lives, and whether that be healthcare, education, the way in which we've moved towards the privatization of public goods and kind of withdrawn from the entire idea of the commons. I think that that's a really powerful story in terms of what we are all experiencing. And then I think that the major challenge with that is the fact that the narrative has become so much about the individual and not at all about the systemic kind of arrangement that we are all enduring. So when we think about, trying to have more or better quality health care or a more efficient delivery of health care, we too have to think about the actual wages and the way in which those individuals who are providing that are their needs as well, because, we have to start to look on the other side of the equation. A lot of people will talk about some of the issues going on the south side of Chicago or Gary or Baltimore even, and point to individuals and, or point to and somehow associate the crime rates or any potential crime that we might see in Black communities, and lay that at the foot of, their parents not trying hard enough or them not doing enough or this or that. And we have to, I think the largest obstacle is to get everyone to see that is so completely false. We have created a system, we've created an economic system in which people are required to work more and more hours for less and less pay and less benefits with less security. That has consequences. Yes. That has serious consequences, and part of that is that people can't necessarily participate in family life in the way in which they would like to. People can't necessarily deal with or think about some of the other things or issues they might be experiencing because they are trying to just keep up. People can't necessarily think about what it means to completely withdraw from the public school system, right, to the detriment of so many children and to all of us collectively, and the kind of accountability that goes with that. So, I think one of the things is just, one, getting people to realize that we have the power to change the economic system that we have created. As we have created it, we have the power to change it. We have the power to change these various institutions, right, that are supposed to be in service to us as opposed to, people be in service to the economy. The economy really needs to be arranged in a way that is going to most benefit the most people, and that is not the reality right now. I think, one, just getting people to see beyond what seems to be this very natural, unchangeable thing, and realizing that we all collectively have the power to change it if we so choose. And the way in which we do that is we organize. And I say some of that to say that I think, in addition to, the institution building and getting people to also, or just allowing people and trying to give people what they need to build themselves, and making sure their soul's all right, I think we need to think about how we can do that organizing in such a way where we can be our whole selves. And then in addition to that, what kinds of economic sustenance can we kind of build into that? That's why I think things like worker cooperatives are really powerful, because it not only gives you a space to organize, which, the workplace has been a major place of organization or organizing for forever, but then it also gives you the power to then own your job. And that allows you to, move politically in whatever ways that you might need to, because you're not necessarily hamstringed by the same things that you would be if you have to be, sometimes accountable or play the game to maintain your 9 to 5 or whatever that looks like. So, one organizer in Detroit, for example, always says is if you can feed yourself, you can free yourself. And I think that's very powerful for me. Yeah. Because we need to think about the ways in which we need to be, radical in our thinking, in the sense that we have to actually change the root cause of so many of these issues, and we not have to only assert our economic and social cultural rights, but we have to think about how we can be in this for the long term, because it's not something that happens, or that certainly happens overnight, but it's not something that we win and then it's over. Like, struggle is constant. I certainly believe that, as Ella Baker always said, struggle is constant. And so if we can think about ways in which we can sustain ourselves as we struggle, and also make sure that those spaces of struggle and organizing are, conducive, I think, to the human spirit, right? Because a lot of times we also need to think about how we can create our own spaces in ways that are going to be healthy and productive for all of us as we continue to do the work. So that's a long way of saying I think there's a lot of work to do. But I do think it's possible, and I do think we're moving in the right direction. I just think we need to be very thoughtful about the kind of organizing we're trying to do, and really be clear as to what our end goal is and what we want the alternative to look like.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Lorenzo. Coming to you now. So I want you to weigh in on this, please.
Okay. Well, I think the biggest challenge is to excite the people to a fever pitch, because the elements are there for people to rally around and to get themselves directly involved as it relates to their own health and welfare and their well-being. And to that end, we have to attempt to, like Reverend Jackson and Renee have been saying, to mobilize and energize people to that end. And I think it can be done through venues such as the one coming up. And also, with respect to what Renee just said, I'd rather be proactive than reactive. So if we begin to build a structure that is proactive instead of reactive, where we put the other side on the defensive and they start listening to us rather than the other way around when a crisis presents itself and people are already in positions to be like shock troops to go and handle any particular task that may come its way. And that would be a big organizing lift for everyone, and it would energize people and have a think tank of folks that are of various age categories and from different walks of life within the African American community that all bring something to the table that can contribute to that. And I think until we have that culmination of things aligning themselves, we'll be dealing with being reactive rather than proactive. So I am encouraged by the conditions that exist in our country and globally right now, because we are in a heavy crisis across the globe, but particularly as in our home, the United States. And I think there's a golden opportunity for organization of the masses, given what's going on right now and all around us. I mean, to Renee's earlier comments, I just saw on the Roland Martin show this morning or yesterday that in Flint, Michigan, now they're talking about foreclosing on people's homes who refuse to pay for undrinkable water, services. And so that's the kind of stuff where we can really hit home, because that affects people across the country. And right now in East Chicago, Indiana, they're dealing with the same thing. I mean, they have contaminated water. They have people that have been moved out of their homes. The government is not talking about compensating them or assisting them to the level that they should. I think there's some activism around that's happening here, but there needs to be a broader coalition of folks that are approaching that. But, oftentimes we operate in silos. But there's a problem in East Chicago. Gary, we don't have enough capacity to help them because we're dealing with our own stuff, and that's by design. And I think, though, we have to be smart enough to say, how do we work together across, cities and towns and counties to make a strong enough bond of folks that can galvanize themselves to take on these issues when they present themselves.
Well, I am just, I'm excited. I'm energized myself as I have listened to each of you, and we're coming to the close of our program, but I want to just kind of try to recap a little bit and then see if there's any final thoughts that any of you have. Let me just underscore some of the things that each of you has contributed to our thinking about how we can continue the struggle which Malcolm X represented, the struggle for our human rights in general and our economic, social, and cultural rights in particular. You've talked about institution building. You've talked about building people up intellectually and spiritually so that people begin to think of ourselves as the freedom fighters that we've been waiting for. You've mentioned organizing. One thing that I think has not yet been mentioned, which I think is a part of organizing and a part of building people up, is that we must reconnect our people with the lessons of past struggles. There's a lot of things that as we look at the landscape today, we see people in a number of places fighting using a number of different means. And one of the things that has both excited me and also disturbed me, and I think I've talked about these in private conversations with each of you at some time or another, it seems that we have a lot of emphasis on the mobilizing of people, getting people out in the streets, getting people to come to this or that kind of activity in order to register our anger and our just rage and to put forward our demands. One of the things that concerns me, however, and I believe it probably concerns each of you as well, is that this mobilizing sometimes, or quite often I would say, is not preceded by and it's not supported by the kind of organizing that you all have talked about. We have to have organizing because we have to build relationships with people. It's one thing for us to be able to get people out in the street, but I think one of the things that has been animating us as we put together this Friday night human rights focus as an education and organizing focus, is that we wanted to be able to contribute to the kind of process whereby we actually reach out and touch one another in our communities. You know, all of us don't go to church, but all of us got issues. And so whether you're a person of faith or a person of conscience, we can talk with other people. We can speak about what's happening, and we can try to build one another up. We can try to help one another understand that Malcolm is gone. Martin is gone. Ella Baker is gone. W.E.B. Du Bois he is gone. We are the human rights fighters that we are waiting for. We have to stand up and do it, because if we don't do it, our children are going to be asking us in much the same way that Tupac and others have asked, you know, of the previous generations, what have y'all done? What are you leaving us? How are you helping us get organized? What are you showing us? So I think that we've got to focus on trying to pass on some of these lessons that we often overlook. This organizing that we have talked about is, I want to focus just for a moment on relationships, because what I see here in Denver is that we have a lot of people who want to be active, but we have not yet figured out how to begin to consistently, on a day-to-day, week-in, week-out basis, come together with people and, you know, really help people to be built up, Reverend Jackson. We don't know how to really get people energized and excited, Lorenzo. We have yet to really get people to understand, Renee, that we can't wait for anybody else to come do this for us. We're going to have to do it for ourselves, and we're going to have to do it collectively. And as you put it beautifully, you know, speaking about Ella Baker, she did say, you know, the struggle is constant. What did she say? We who believe in freedom cannot rest. And so that's our task, I think, as we look forward, as we think about the significance of Malcolm X's life, and as we think about the significance of his death, and as we think about where we are right now in this country with white supremacy, you know, sort of just, you know, reinvigorating itself from one end of the country to the other, I think that we now have to take seriously what we can see as the practice of those who have gone before, and we have to figure out how each of us can begin to reach deep for our own best selves and try to figure out how we can become the freedom fighters that we've been waiting for. Any final thoughts that any of you want to offer at this point?
Well, I would just say that organizing is a ongoing, perpetual job. And I think that I'm looking and have been looking to engage the Gen X's, the millennials, and have been doing it at some level, but then combine them with the old school folks, because everyone has something to jointly bring together. And I think once we bridge the generational gap between the generations themselves that I have described, I think you will find that we will have a formidable force to be reckoned with in terms of any organizing and task that we would take on. And I think that, and going forward, you have passed the proverbial torch on to the younger generation who will go into the future organizing struggles as they exist and will come to be in the future. So I think that is an objective of mine that I've been longing to see happen and have been working towards throughout my organizing life as an organizer. And I think it's critical going forward for that to happen. And I would just say that.
Let me just underscore what you just said, Lorenzo, because you and I have talked about this need for an intergenerational conversation. Because absent that, we will not be able to do the kind of organizing that each of you has said we need. Absent that, we will not be listening to each other to try to learn the new ways of thinking about our struggle. And the younger folks have a lot of energy, but they don't always have the kinds of lived experiences that some of us who are still fighting have had. We need to be able to share some of those lessons with them. And at the same time, we need to be humble enough to listen to the new ways that people are thinking about how things need to be done. So I just wanted to add that because I think you're absolutely right about the need for intergenerational unity. Reverend Jackson and Renee, if you have any final thoughts, please share them with us.
Well, on that relationship and intergenerational conversations and experiences, I'm reminded of the late historian, Dr. James Melvin Washington, who said that that every revolution throughout history has always taught to the next generation the values of that revolution so that they could carry it on. And as Renee was quoting Ella Baker, that the struggle continues. And so whether it was the French Revolution, they taught to the next generation the values of the revolution, the Russian Revolution. And he pointed out even the American Revolution, they taught the values of a lie, but they taught it. And the succeeding generations carried it on. Unfortunately, he pointed out, though, that the civil rights revolution in this country, we failed to teach the values of that revolution to those coming after. And so that revolution began to waver and began to die. And so that's where we got to, I want to emphasize that, we got to teach these values. And as you said, we got to be willing to interact and be in the room with and listen to and share with. And that's a part of relationship that is a struggle now because we got so much technology. We have to struggle now because we don't live in neighborhoods anymore. And we just live in hoods. And so we go into our homes, we put on, we get our iPad, put our headphones on, and even in our own homes, we don't have good relationships with one another. And we got to recognize that just because technology allows you new toys and tools, that doesn't mean progress. And we keep conflating, thinking that just because we got all these tools and toys, we are making progress. No, we're not we're regressing because it's taking us further and further away from one another. We can't have a revolution and organize through Facebook. We can't have a revolution and organize. They can, these things can be a part of it, but some of us are Facebook revolutionaries. Some of us, are texting, and I'm not against it. I'm saying we're leaning on it, and it's taking us away from just being around one another. Because in this fight, all of us are going to have some personal struggles that are added to the bigger fight that we're fighting. And in those personal struggles, I need to know that you're not only with me because we're fighting against white supremacy. I need to know that you're with me because you care about me. That if something happens to me in my life, that you care about me, that you just don't care about me because I'm a soldier in this army. But no, you care about me. And so I think that in building relationships, we have to recognize that this society tries to distract us and pull us away from the genuine relationships of seeing one another, of being around each other, of asking one another, how you doing? How you doing? And getting to that level. And then once we get to that level, we link together. And when we link together, all of the stuff that you're talking about, we can accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, yeah. Well, Ella Baker Jr.
Well, just I think if I could just maybe echo some of all the comments that have been made, and I think,
Absolutely.
each of you really have have touched on, I think, the very question that we all collectively have to answer is what is exactly that we're fighting for? What are we trying to create, and what are we trying to, or what are we trying to destroy and create in its place? And so much of that, I think, speaks to the kind of personal work that we need to do, but then also the kind of work that we have to do together, and goes way beyond, I understand, and I think I sometimes share in the frustrations of feeling as if we are sometimes mobilizing for the sake of mobilizing, with no real concrete long-term strategy to what we're actually trying to accomplish. But I also understand the need for that in some cases, and also understand how it does fuel and energize people in the larger, hopefully the larger goal of whatever it is we're trying to achieve. But I think we're more or less going to have to grapple with exactly what are we trying to create together, and what kind of personal work do we have to do to actually make sure that we can do that and create that alternative for ourselves. And I would just say in conclusion that part of that, again, has to be, as you said, Tandabantu, is learning from the previous struggles and movements of the past and incorporating study into our organizing spaces, because I think that lends itself to doing that kind of, collective strategizing, and then also just making sure that we're kind to one another and that we're patient with one another as we try to build out, some of these spaces and build these institutions, and try to be forgiving of one another as we go along in this process. But, I guess in conclusion, I would just say that so much of the work that I think needs to be done really is centered around asserting and fulfilling our economic, social, and cultural rights, and using the human rights framework as we start to think about the work that there is to be done.
Well, thank you. Thanks to each and every one of you, Reverend Dr. Jackson, Brother Lorenzo Crowell, Attorney RENEE HATCHER. It's been a really, I feel like the conversation actually is just getting started, but we can only go as long as we have gone. So what we need to do is get each of you back at some future time. I hope that you'll be able to make some time in your schedule as we look forward to bringing you back with some other brothers and sisters, so that we can continue these Friday evening human rights discussions, particularly around the race treaty and how we can use it. And we need to get down to some brass tacks, I think, about how we actually can begin to document more and more of our experiences, because the documenting process that we referenced in the past is an essential part of organizing. I think once we begin to help people begin to look at what they're actually experiencing and putting on paper those things that are happening, we know that we can present that documentation to a larger international body. We can actually pull the covers. We can pull the covers off of a lot of stuff that's going on. So we thank everybody. We thank our audience. And Brother Scotty, take us on out.